Hi, welcome to my MTSS 101, Why MTSS. My name is Stephanie Dyer. I am a school psychologist by training and a BCBA, and have actually worked for the MiMTSS Technical Assistance Center for the past 10 years. And recently I began working for the state autism project, the START project. So we are going to be talking today about why MTSS. And this session is really intended to support those who are exploring an MTSS framework by building some background knowledge and identifying some actionable next steps. Some of you may be selecting this breakout session because not necessarily because you need to build your background knowledge, but you might be looking for language to help others understand MTSS. So after our session today, you should be able to define what a multi-tiered system of support is, what that framework contains, and how to use data-based decision-making to create an efficient, effective, and equitable MTSS framework. So we're going to start off with a quick write. I'm going to put 60 seconds on the clock, and I would love for you to just jot down on a piece of scrap paper everything you know about MTSS at this moment. Okay? Ready? Go. Okay, so go ahead and hold on to that, keep it close. We're going to come back to what you wrote in a few minutes. So I think it helps when we are trying to understand MTSS to use a real life example. So I'm going to use a dental health analogy. So my first question to you is this: what are some of those universal prevention strategies or instruction that are effective for strong dental health for most people? So you're probably thinking things like flossing, brushing, having those regular cleanings, getting those x-rays once a year. And those are things that are intended to prevent further problems from occurring. Now, think about those strategies or interventions that might be needed for some people to improve their dental health. So maybe you're thinking about things like fillings, if you have a cavity, or fluoride treatments. For me, I needed to have a bite guard because I was grinding down the back of my teeth. So on top of my preventative care 2 times a year, I needed an intervention called a bite guard to help me with a specific situation. Now think about what intensive dental health interventions might be in place and might be necessary for a few people. And so many times people say things like root canals or implants. I've also had one crown, and the crown was given because, or inserted because I had a fracture in my tooth. So I had the preventative care. I have a supplemental intervention in terms of a bite guard, and I needed an intensive intervention in terms of a crown to deal with a specific situation with a tooth. So my question is, even if we have these additional interventions, are we still getting that universal preventive care? Yes. Even if we've had an intensive intervention? Yes. So the idea here is that we want universal prevention for all. Some are going to need a little more intervention, and some may need more intensive intervention. And MTSS is very similar to this analogy. So this should look familiar, this MTSS triangle. And the reason the triangle is used is because it's really a very simple and straightforward visual representation of the supports along a continuum. So the premise is this: we provide core instruction or universal support for all students. And our goal is that those supports are allowing at least 80% of our students to be successful academically and behaviorally. Then about 7 to 15% of students may need a targeted intervention or something else in addition to Tier 1 in order to be successful. And this often looks like targeted small group interventions. And then there may be more students who need more intervention on top of the Tier 1 and the Tier 2. And that would be more intensive, in a more individualized type of intervention or intensification of some interventions. So the takeaway here is that none of these tiers operate in isolation. They all build upon each other. Students who are receiving Tier 3 intervention for behavior, for example, are still having benefit of that core instruction and behavioral support at Tier 1. So one of the things that we want to be really careful of is that we are describing the intensity or the level of supports, not labeling students. So there's no Tier 3 student or yellow zone student, or these are our Tier 2 students, right? I'm not a Tier 3 dental patient because I have received a intensive intervention, right? I am a dental patient who needed a Tier 3 intervention at one point. So same with students. They have needs that we're meeting through levels of support, but they are not labeled as such. All right, so we're gonna do a quick check. And here what I'd like to do is just give you about 20 seconds to go ahead and fill in the blanks, answer true or false, and then complete that last bullet on the screen. All right, so let's go ahead and show those answers. So for the first one, Tier 1 is universal prevention and core instruction, and it should allow at least 80% of students to be successful academically and behaviorally. Tier 2 targeted intervention is provided in addition to Tier 1 core instruction for some students. True. Tier 2 is not provided in isolation of Tier 1, and it is intended for some students. Tier 3 intensive intervention is intended for about 7 to 15% of students with similar needs and provided in targeted groups. True or false? And here we'll say mostly false. Tier 3 intensive intervention is really about 1 to 5% of students and tends to be more individualized. And then lastly, I'm currently receiving individualized behavior support through a behavior intervention plan. How would you describe me? What I hope we're not doing is saying, well, she is a Tier 3 student. No, I would say that I'm a student with support of a behavior intervention plan, or I'm a student who currently has support of a behavior intervention plan. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the Michigan Department of Education's definition of MTSS. And this is coming from the MDE MTSS practice profile, which you can find in the handout that's in your Dropbox on the list of resources. So I would like you to go ahead and just take a minute and read this definition to yourself and jot down some keywords or phrases that stand out to you. Okay, so during our live session, participants identified things like the intentionally interconnects, they identified research-based strategies, they identified the phrase, so all learners succeed, and a couple people pointed out the word efficient. So whatever words stuck out to you is a great way to think about how you can connect and relate to this definition of MTSS. All right, so also in the MDE MTSS practice profile is the outlining of 5 essential components of MTSS, and you can see them listed on your screen. What I really love about this image of a pinwheel is that it depicts the fact that each of these 5 components really have their own function and vital role in the whole MTSS system. But the pinwheel, having them all together on the pinwheel, shows that they're all really interrelated and necessary to have a really efficient, effective, and equitable MTSS framework. All right, so one of the things I think that is helpful to understand when we're trying to define MTSS and make it fit into maybe what we already do is to just understand a little bit about the history of MTSS in education. And another reason that's important is so that we don't get caught in thinking that MTSS is another fad or another initiative. If you were live with me, I'd say who's been involved in an initiative in schools that was kind of passing, and everyone can raise their hand. So this is different than that. So let's start with response to intervention. Many of you I know have heard this term. So response to intervention really became more well known when the IDEA, or our special education law, reauthorized in 2004. And what it did at that time is it allowed response to intervention to be another way that we would be able to identify students for special education services under the specific learning disability. So because of that, many people became really aware of what response to intervention was. However, RTI has deep, deep roots going well back into the 1970s around the work in curriculum-based measurement. Stanley Dino and colleagues back in the 70s. So I remember as a school psychologist in my internship in the early 90s, running around in some of the schools I was working in and photocopying passages from first grade basal readers and doing oral fluency probes. And then we would graph it, and that was, the beginning of curriculum-based measurement. And so RTI goes back to that work. It also goes back even further to work in direct instruction and precision teaching. So deep roots when it comes to the response to intervention. PBIS, many of you are very familiar with, is a framework that takes an instructional approach to behavioral support and has a real deep focus on prevention through setting up the environment to support behavior, to support students and staff. So PBIS has its roots in applied behavior analysis, again, very rich history. So MTSS has systematically integrated that rich, robust work in RTI, response to intervention, and that research validated set of work in PBIS and pulled them together in a framework that allows for efficient, effective, and equitable practices in schools. Okay, so what do we mean by an integrated MTSS model? Some of you have heard that, some of you use that phrase yourself. So if we look at the bullets on this slide, we really kind of see this like chicken egg effect. So children, what we know is children who fall behind academically will be more likely to find academic work aversive and more likely to find kind of escaping that work reinforcing, right? So we know this. We also know that when we implement school-wide PBIS really well, we see increased academic engagement and enhanced academic outcomes. When we are minimizing some of the behavior that might be getting in the way of learning, we're able to have more time and more success with the academic piece. And then we also, on the other side of that, find that when we have high quality academic instruction going on, active engagement, lots of opportunities to respond for all students, lots of feedback to students, that alone can reduce what we typically view as challenging behavior. Dr. Anita Archer has a quote that I just love, and it says, "Where there is a void, they fill it." right? So when we don't have engaging instruction, students are left to sort of fill that space. And what we know is they're not filling it by doing extra math problems or reading ahead. They're filling it with those things that tend to then lead to them getting in trouble or behavioral challenges. Okay, so I want to show you with some data from a school that I used to work in how this connection actually looks like in real life. So on the left of your screen, you see a blue graph. And what this is, it is showing the percentage of students that were at benchmark on a reading screener for each grade K through 5. So really we're looking at that percent at benchmark column. And you can see, for example, that first grade had 26% of their students that were at benchmark for reading. Fourth grade had 50%. Fifth grade had 19% at benchmark, for example. And benchmark's really that minimum that we're looking for. So if you look at the graph on the right, we see the same data for reading screening that's shown in the green stripe. So that's going to match the data that we just looked at on the left. But what we've added is the blue bar, which is showing behavior referrals. So for kindergarten, for example, we can see that they've had about 21 behavior referrals in that grade, and they have about 41 students that are at benchmark for reading. So I want you to just pause for about 10 seconds and just look for any patterns that you see in that graph on the right. Okay, so if you are like the group that I was live with yesterday, what you are probably noticing is that inverse relationship between the number of behavior referrals and the number of students, the percent of students in that grade that are reading at benchmark. So for example, if we look at the second grade, we see that second grade has 57% of their students who are reading at benchmark based on the screener, and they have about 15, 16 referrals. We can see that they have lower referrals and higher benchmark scores on reading compared to some of the other grades. Conversely, if we look at the fifth grade, we can see that the fifth grade has almost 80 referrals for that grade level this year so far, and they have only 19% of their students reading at benchmark. So we tend to see, again, that chicken egg effect between lower reading and higher behavior, lower outcome data for reading. All right, and so again, just coming back to the triangle so that we can see this integration. So at all tiers, we're talking about integrating academic and behavior. Tier 1, we have that rich core curriculum, high yield instructional strategies, high yield behavioral strategies for all students. Then we're layering on those targeted academic and or behavioral interventions for some students. And then we're intensifying those interventions or having individual plans for a few students at that intensive level. All right, so I'm also going to just give you a second to pull out your quick write description of MTSS and consider which of these 4 categories you would sort of assess your description at. Like number 1, you were spot on. Number 2, you had many descriptors included, but you'd need to add a couple additional ones. 3, you're like, hey, I'm 50-50 between what I wrote down and new information that I just learned. Or 4, like, could I please just rewrite my description? I'm just gonna give you about 10 seconds to consider what you would choose, and then to just go ahead and scribble any additional notes in that quick write that you'd like to add. Okay, so now what we're going to do is talk about why even have MTSS in the first place. So there on the screen, you will see some common compelling whys for for districts, for schools, for ISDs to even consider implementing an MTSS framework. So we're going to talk about the evidence of effectiveness on student outcomes. Sometimes that is the reason that people want to build an MTSS framework. Another compelling why is because people are very committed to having an efficient, effective, and equitable access to instruction and intervention for all meaning all students. Sometimes people are compelled to implement MTSS because it is a very powerful national focus right now, and there is legislation around this. And others are drawn to the systems level benefit that you can get when you really truly implement those 5 essential components of MTSS that we mentioned that are in the MDE MTSS practice profile. And you may have additional compelling whys for why you are interested in implementing or strengthening MTSS in your district or school. So let's go ahead and start with looking at the evidence to support MTSS. And I've got a little, there we go. What we see is that MTSS has an impact on both student outcomes and system outcomes. So at the student level, when we look at research, and this is certainly not all-inclusive, the research that is cited here, but we see decreases in exclusionary practices such as expulsion and suspension. We also see a decrease in behavior referrals. We see increased on-time graduation. And we also see sustained academic improvement. So for example, in one study, children who were identified at risk of difficulty with reading in kindergarten were followed through 3rd grade. And the majority of children in this group responded early and positively to intervention. And at the end of kindergarten, they really were positioned to be on trajectory of later reading performance that exceeded the 50th percentile on the majority of measures that sustained over time. So really exciting, strong student outcomes with implementation of MTSS. We also find really strong positive effects on systems outcomes, things that are probably very attractive to you, such as having increased instructional and planning time, having more efficient use of resources and staff, which is really helpful, especially right now when we have so much turnover in staff. We see decreased inappropriate special ed referrals, decreased placement rates. For students who are receiving special education programs and services, a reduction in time that they're actually out of gen ed, and a reduction in retaining students. And another way to look at these strong outcomes is to look at effect size. And I know many of you are familiar with John Hattie's work and his barometer to show really the effect size of many, 270 plus influences on student achievement. So for those who are not familiar, what an effect size is, it's really a measure. It's a number that shows us the relationship between 2 variables. So what Dr. Hattie has done is he has looked at many things and their impact on student achievement. So for example, what is the impact of summer break on student achievement? What is the impact of feedback on student achievement, et cetera? And so he has this barometer, and that number that shows that effect between the 2 variables, anything that's 0.4 or higher is likely due to that relationship. So for example, I said summer break and student achievement. That actually has a reverse effect. That is less than 0 there, less than 0.0. Has a reverse effect. It's a negative effect on student achievement. Whereas when we look at MTSS, it is a 1.07 effect on student achievement, meaning we can be highly confident that MTSS and the components of MTSS have a very strong impact on student achievement. All right, and I think perhaps one of the most exciting outcomes of MTSS are the components that can facilitate equitable outcomes. So here's what we have long known, that poor outcomes persist for students of color, students from low-income families, English learners, and students with disabilities. Outcomes such as low academic performance, dropout, suspensions, expulsions. We know that there's evidence that a student's race is a significant predictor of academic outcomes. And we know that there is a disproportionate representation of culturally and linguistically diverse students that receive special education. So in the MTSS equity brief that you see referenced on the screen, Dr. Dia Jackson from the Center on MTSS at the American Institute for Research notes several components of MTSS that make it really a viable approach to addressing some of these inequitable outcomes. So things like having strong leadership, strong team-based leadership around the MTSS framework, having professional learning, having high-quality instruction and early intervention, and culturally responsive assessments for instruction. These are some of those components that lead to team-based, data-based decision-making, team-based, data-based decision-making that facilitate those equitable outcomes. And I want to show you a graph that Dr. Kent McIntosh shared a couple of years ago at the PBIS forum. And this shows the effect of PBIS on an exclusionary practice of out-of-school suspensions. So I know this is blurry, but the yellow bar is showing students with IEPs and the percentage of out-of-school suspensions. And then the blue line shows the Black students who have received out-of-school suspensions. Red is all students, and the green is Hispanic students. And this was over a 5-year period in a study of schools in Wisconsin who were implementing PBIS. And what you can see just visually, without even looking at the numbers, is that there was a significant decrease in the number of out-of-school suspensions for all subgroups when PBIS was implemented with fidelity. Now, we still have work to do because students with IEPs and Black students still are very disproportionately higher than all students, but certainly we're seeing that nice sharp decline. And when we look in our own state, at a Michigan example, we had an ISD who started their work building an MTSS framework with the PBIS or behavioral side. And what they did is they looked at their students with IEPs, and the schools that were building a PBIS system, and they tracked their out-of-school suspensions from previous years to the year that they were implementing. And their first cohort of schools, they found a reduction of 429 days of out-of-school suspension of students with IEPs that were in that first cohort. That is huge. And then their second cohort, there was a reduction of 485 days of out-of-school suspension. So I can't do the math here on the fly, but that's 914 instructional days that were recouped for the student. And I think that's, I can't do the math, 4 or 5 years worth of days, right? So very powerful. All right, so what about students with IEPs? And so there's a lot of different approaches that people are taking with regard to special education and the 3 tiers. Here's what we do know, that Tier 3 is inclusive of students with and without disabilities. So it's not only for students with an IEP, it doesn't exclude students with an IEP, and it's certainly not a place. We don't have, a Tier 3 room or a Tier 3, school or a special education being a hall or a classroom, right? It is the services and programs that we're providing. So not only is Tier 3 inclusive of students with and without disabilities, so are Tiers 1 and 2. And what we know from IDEA, our special ed law, is that students with IEPs are first and foremost general education students. So therefore, all the interventions and supports that are available to students in your school are also available to students with an IEP. So let's go ahead and take a look at some more language around how MTSS really can address the needs of all students. So this comes from some of the Federal Office of Special Ed letters to colleagues, and it defines a multi-tiered instructional framework as a school-wide approach that addresses the needs of all students, including struggling learners and students with disabilities. It integrates assessment and intervention within that multi-level instructional and behavioral system, MTSS, to maximize achievement and reduce problem behavior. Very clear that it's including all students. Now, what we do know is if a student has an IEP, we obviously need to make sure that everything in that IEP is being provided. But I want to propose to you this triangle and thinking about IEPs, students with IEPs. So sometimes it's described to me like, well, our students with IEPs are like on their own triangle over here. Like we have this gen ed triangle, and then we have this other triangle. Sometimes it's like, well, this triangle is sort of up here, over here somewhere at the top. Sometimes it's like, well, that very, very peak in the red, like we have it be more maroon, and that's where students with IEPs live. So what we know from what we just read and looked at is that, again, students with IEPs are first and foremost general education students, meaning that this triangle that you see on the screen applies to them as well, right? So students that have an IEP are students, and they should have benefit of that Tier 1 core curriculum, high yield instructional and behavioral strategies that all students are getting. Then if they need more, they may be able to access the Tier 2 interventions in your school. The IEP and the purpose of the IEP is to allow access to and progress in general ed. It's to outline those supports and services that allow students to be able to access general education and be educated with their peers who are non-disabled. So it's not separate, it's all together in one system. All right, so equitable outcomes is a compelling why for MTSS. Another compelling why for MTSS is looking at the federal and state context. So what we do know is that the State School Aid Act of 1979 was amended around 2015 to include MTSS and provide some funding around MTSS being used for some specific purposes. We know that federally, when No Child Left Behind was reauthorized as ESSA, it included multiple references to MTSS as a way to increase student achievement. Our Michigan Top 10 Strategic Education Plan continues to have goals for which MTSS is a strategy for reaching those goals. And our State Systemic Improvement Plan, which is a federal requirement outlining how we are going to measure results for students with disabilities, includes MTSS as an explicit strategy. So if your compelling why really is around getting excited about that federal and state context, all of that is in place and also shows the importance of MTSS as it's embedded in all of these policies. All right, and also there's a lot of national focus on MTSS because it's effective. And so you see on the screen many of the partners that both Michigan Department of Education and the MiMTSS Technical Assistance Center have had benefit of working with, and this list is not all-inclusive. So you can see that the breadth and depth of the work nationally around MTSS. Okay, and then the last compelling why that we're going to mention is systems level outcomes. So some of you may be really interested in MTSS because it moves us away from being person dependent to very systems dependent, and it allows us to see really impactful outcomes at that systems level like we talked about earlier. So when we're implementing with Fidelity, an MTSS framework should help us see supports that are designed for each and every learner in our school. We should see a system that's really fostering family engagement and community partners, and a system, this is really exciting especially now, that has sustainable structures to support implementation even when we have turnover. And you can see again the other systems level outcomes, including alignment across our educational system. So this, for many people, is a compelling reason to implement MTSS. And what I want to do now is stop talking, and so that you can hear from some people in the field who are talking about that systemic benefit of implementing MTSS. So here you will see Sarah Weaver from the MiMTSS TA Center having a conversation with Lynette Beret, who is the MTSS coordinator at Copper Country ISD up in Houghton.
It's really resulted in a huge paradigm shift. it's just shifted attitudes about education. You know, it used to be about general ed and special ed, and just if kids qualified for special ed or they just got general ed. And now we have this whole continuum of supports. And I think the schools are less focused on, you know, special ed versus general ed. They're more focused on what's the most appropriate way that we can, you know, reach everybody. And then when we're looking at tier 2 supports, how can we match kids up so that it makes sense and we're likely to have the best outcomes. So it's constant learning. It's a, you know, forever long building process, but it's so worth it.
Okay, so I want to give you about 20 seconds to pause and to think about what is your compelling why for MTSS. So you will see some things listed on the screen here. And these are the ones that we just talked about. So maybe your compelling why is that evidence of effectiveness on student outcomes. Maybe it's because you really are committed to an efficient, effective, equitable access to instruction and intervention for all students. Maybe your compelling why is really aligning and understanding the legislation and that national focus on MTSS implementation. Or maybe it's those systems level benefits that come from those 5 essential components of MTSS. Maybe you have other reasons. Go ahead and pause again for about 15 seconds and jot down your reasons. Why would you want to strengthen or implement MTSS in your district or school? Okay, so I've been saying these words. I've been saying efficient, effective, and equitable. And in order for our MTSS framework to be efficient, effective, and equitable, we need to do more than just implement a lot of interventions or practices. We want to put together all of these components that you see shown in this diagram on your screen. So when we have systems, those are the things that support staff behavior, the things that help to make this sustainable over time. We have practices. Those are the things, the interventions, what we're doing to help support student academic and behavior. And we have data that supports our decision making so that we can achieve these outcomes that we want to see. So we're going to briefly look at each of those separate components. So with regard to systems, as I said, these are the things that support staff. They support staff behavior. And a critical piece of that is having team-based leadership. So this is defined in the MTSS practice profile as an active, organized, knowledgeable, and representative group that provides whole child supports, removes barriers, coordinates this work, and evaluates activities for the district in terms of how this all aligns with the broader educational system. So having that team-based leadership allows us to have staff that change, and yet we still have a group that is coordinating the work, you know, using the data to make decisions and keeping things sustainable. In addition, we have some specialized functions. So you see 5 bullets here, and this does not necessarily mean you need 5 full-time people to do these things. These are functions. So you might have somebody who is designated as your district MTSS coordinator who also takes on some data coordination roles, who might do some professional learning in your district as a trainer. You may have school leadership team coaches or coaches in your buildings that have multiple roles as well. Another specialized function that's important to consider is to have someone on your team who does have that behavioral expertise and somebody who has that academic expertise, for example, let's say literacy. Another example of team structures and functions is this table that we use in the MiMTSS Technical Assistance Center in some of our trainings. So it's just an example of the different types of teams and the level of focus. So that system level coordination, we tend to call the school leadership team at that building level. There's a district leadership team as well. And then we define grade level teams. So grade levels are really looking at that tier 1 or the intervention system, tier 2, tier 3. We have interventionist meetings as a team structure. So getting those interventionists, those that are providing reading intervention or behavioral intervention together regularly to look at the student data and make decisions. And then we have those student support teams so that when a student does require that more individualized or more intensified level of intervention, that we can kind of pull together a team that's invested and knows that student that can make that plan more individualized and effective. Another example of systems is alignment, making sure that MTSS is not occurring in this silo and other things are in this silo, but that we have alignment across the work. And so on the MiMTSS TA Center website, you will see a web page that specifically helps provide guidance around connecting MTSS with MyKIP, for example. The other systems piece that is really important that many of you may already have in place, and that is a framework that has that tiered delivery system. And we want to make sure that we are matching the interventions that we have with the needs of the students that we have. So we want to make sure that we're also providing a continuum so that we have things for all, things for some, things for a few, and that we are considering always layering on how to intensify those supports along the way to make them even more effective. So we're just going to look quickly at the definition of each tier. Hopefully this is just confirming what you already know and are doing. But as I mentioned earlier, we want to provide that core instruction or that universal support to all students with the goal of that being successful for at least 80% of our students. What we know is that many times we have more students that need tier 2, more students that need tier 3, and we don't have that 80% success at tier 1. And so that pushes on our tier 1. When we have too many students that need more individualized support, we're often not able to provide that. Our system isn't equipped to handle that much need for resources and staff. So it pushes on tier 1. And the more that we can tighten up and strengthen tier 1 through those core academic and behavioral practices, the less it pushes on tier 2 and tier 3. Okay, let's look at tier 2. So tier 2 is often defined very differently depending on your district or school. We define tier 2 as being something, again, that is in addition to that core instruction, and that it's typically a small group intervention, whether it's a reading intervention or a behavioral intervention that is using a validated research program. And it's for students with similar needs. What needs to happen for tier 2, regardless of how you are defining it, is tier 2 should include more practice, more feedback, more reinforcement, more structure, more. We want to have some urgency around tier 2 because this is a time where we are really trying to be able to get students back to the expectations at tier 1. Being successful with what we're providing at tier 1. So we want to get really urgent around those tier 2 interventions and provide all of those extra good instructional things that we know could move the dial for students. Okay, when we look at tier 3, this focuses on intensifying what we're doing at tier 2 so that the student gets even more dosage or even more feedback, for example. And it also is the place where we start doing some more problem solving at this individual student level. So very important here at tier 3 that we are using that progress monitoring data to make sure that we can adjust and intensify our interventions rapidly based on the data. And that usually we're pulling in a team here with some expertise in the behavioral need or the academic need to help us really intensify those interventions. And this is a point that may include a functional behavior assessment or a behavior intervention plan. All right, I want to pause here for about 60 seconds and let you take time to think about your system components. So if you have downloaded this form from the Dropbox, that's great. If not, just make a T-chart on a piece of paper that says systems. And on one side, please kind of reflect and write down the system components for MTSS that your district or school or ISD already has in place. Maybe you have team-based leadership. Maybe you are defining the tiers pretty clearly. And then on the other side, go ahead and put those components that might need to be developed or intentionally strengthened. Like maybe you're like, oh, we don't really have coaches yet. Or maybe we don't have clearly defined tiers, and so everyone's just like kind of confused. Go ahead and take 60 seconds and jot down your thoughts about your system. Okay, so now let's move off of systems and let's talk for a minute about practices. And practices are those things that are supporting student behavior, whether it's academic behavior or behavior. And so on this chart, you can see some guidance or a definition around what this might look like at each tier. So for example, at Tier 1 reading, the instruction here is including all students, and it should cover those big ideas of reading and use effective instructional practices. Then Tier 2 interventions would be additional supplemental interventions that are provided to students who need more in addition to that core reading instruction. And then at Tier 3, we may be intensifying those components of those reading interventions with a goal of really addressing the individual student need at this point. So intensifying those interventions, we might be providing more. We might be providing more reinforcement, different reinforcement. We might be providing more practice, even in addition to all the practice they're getting at Tier 2, for example. Behavior is going to be the same way. So at Tier 1, we should be considering implementing those big ideas of PBIS at all, in all levels, in all school areas, across the whole school environment. And this is where we are teaching those expectations. We are practicing them. We are acknowledging them. We are making sure that we're really focused on the things students are doing that are demonstrating those expectations, and then reteaching those expectations for students that are still not demonstrating them in the way that we're hoping to see. So we also want to make sure at Tier 1 that PBIS is being implemented in all classrooms. So our classrooms, using those school-wide expectations like be safe, be responsible, be respectful, but then layering in their own very clear procedures and routines, and teaching those and practicing those and acknowledging those. And then at Tier 2, for students that are not being successful with that alone, we're layering on again those more targeted groups to get that extra practice, extra structure, more feedback. And then Tier 3, again, we might intensify some of those behavioral interventions or actually move into more of an individualized behavior support plan. All right, so considerations around practices around selecting the practices and actually implementing these practices. We want to be careful that when we're choosing interventions, that we're choosing them because there's evidence that gives us confidence that this intervention is going to be successful for the needs of this group of students. So I know back in, my experience in schools, we often really just had the interventions that we had, right? And we would put students into intervention groups because it seemed like the closest fit, or, wow, that interventionist was so great. Like if we could just put these students in with that person, like magic would happen, right? And so we want to be really careful with our selection so that we are, again, having that urgency, having high confidence that we can move the dial for a student. We also want to consider the philosophy of our district, the current initiatives that are already in place, and can we kind of combine all of this, make this aligned, and then considering the resources and our capacity to really support implementation with fidelity. Lots to think about. So you may have seen these terms, evidence-based, effective practice. It can be very confusing, especially when you're trying to select really good intervention materials. So these definitions come from the sources you can see on the screen. There are multiple definitions for each of these terms, but basically on the screen what we see is evidence-based is really saying that this whole package together has been proven to successfully improve student outcomes. Research-based is more that some parts of the program. So maybe the feedback component or the reinforcement component or the extra practice component, those things have all been research-based. They've been shown to be proven, but those are just components of the whole. Effective practice might be backed by research, but just less high quality research. And then best practice is like, this really works for me. Maybe it'll work for you. It's kind of more personal. So how do we find out what that evidence-based practice is and what practices are considered to be evidence-based? And just here are some resources for you to consider that weigh all the evidence and that help you kind of determine what is evidence-based versus research-based versus best practice, for example. Okay. So I just again want to give you a few seconds to make that T-chart again, but this time around practices. So what practices do you already have that are supporting student academics and behavior with regard to MTSS? And then what components around practices might you still need to strengthen? So maybe it's your selection process. Maybe it's, gosh, we have good things going at Tier 2, but we could strengthen the practices around Tier 3. Go ahead and give you about 30 seconds to consider that. Okay, so the last component in that graphic is data, and data supports our decision making. So within MTSS, we talk about a comprehensive assessment system. That's the term that's used in the MDE MTSS practice profile. And that includes data assessments that are around student outcomes. So we might have universal screenings or our progress monitoring data or formative data, summative data, et cetera. We talk about systems level data or systems assessment that are around capacity and fidelity, and we'll talk more about those in just a second. And that we're using the data to systematically evaluate how effective our instruction is, how effective our interventions are, because that allows us to make those changes when we see that we need to get stronger outcomes, right? We can make those adjustments as we go. The data is also used to evaluate the quality of our supports and how equitable they are. Are students accessing those supports in an equitable way? Are we seeing equitable progress? And then we can also use data to evaluate how responsive our system is. Are we catching all of the students? Are students being able to, again, access our interventions and make progress within those interventions? So when we look at the types of MTSS data, we really kind of look at 4 buckets of data. So you may already have really strong background knowledge on this. You may already be using all 4 types. The important thing is, and I know it was mentioned in previous sessions, is that collection of data is one thing, but using the data we collect meaningfully is what matters. So the capacity is really looking at to what degree is your ISD or district in a position to effectively support schools with the implementation of MTSS. What is their capacity to do that? Fidelity is really getting at how well have we put in and implemented the features of MTSS as intended. Basically, are we doing what we said we would do? Are we doing what we know will be effective? And this is measured on things like the school-wide PBIS tiered fidelity inventory, the reading tiered fidelity inventory. Those are just 2 examples of fidelity measures. At the individual student level, we often have, fidelity measures around implementation of the behavior plan. At a reading intervention level, we might have fidelity checklists to say how well are we implementing the key components of intervention X. Scale and reach is helping ISDs and districts think about their rollout of MTSS through the stages of implementation, through the number of buildings in their district. So if I have a district where I have 10 buildings, let's say, I might start with, 3 of my elementary schools and kind of get that up and running. With the scale up plan of the next year, I'm adding on the next 3, and then I'm adding on secondary. Or you might start with, tier 1 for everyone, then you might add on a different tier. However you are wanting to roll that out, this would be a planful way, and the scale and reach data would help you with that. And then lastly, the impact and outcome data we've talked a lot about today. That's your universal screening, your progress monitoring data, etc. Okay, so I want to give you an example of how this data can be really, really important to that efficient, effective, equitable system. So when we are thinking about, interventions in particular, we talk about having some decision rules to allow us to truly be efficient, effective, and equitable. So I just want to talk about these for a quick minute. So when we think about effective, I don't know about you, but again, I spent many, many years at tables problem solving and making decisions about individual students. And like I said a few minutes ago, we often sometimes paired students with interventions simply because we had them or because we thought the interventionist was just such a phenomenal instructor and connector with kids that we thought it didn't matter what she was doing, like it would help, right? So it often wasn't the right fit, or there's just lots of thinking and feeling about interventions. And some students, honestly, once they were in an intervention, never ever stopped or got out of that intervention. And we didn't really even seem to have any real urgency around this. It was almost like it was just expected. So now we know we need urgency. We want to move the dial for students to help them achieve and be more successful. And so we want to select the right intervention for the specific needs based on their skill or performance. And having these decision rules around matching a student with the right intervention allows us to be more effective. So efficiency. Again, I'm going to talk about the tables that I sat around for lots of years. Have you ever sat around those tables and it feels like we're talking about the same student forever? Lots of times. And we often had like binders where teachers would sign up for slots to kind of talk and problem solve around individual students. And we always ran out of time before any real plan was developed. And then they had to come back and it just took too long. So students do not have enough time for us to take this much talking time. We want to get them into an intervention as soon as possible. And so if we have some clear criteria around entrance criteria, for example, how do you access that intervention? What database decisions tell us that that would be the good intervention for this student? Then we can be definitely much more efficient. And then lastly, the equitable decision making. This is where our human nature can really trip us up. If we have some entrance criteria, if we have progress monitoring guidelines, if we have clear decision rules around our interventions and around that student progress, then it allows us to make those decisions in a more data-based, equitable way than just my own thoughts and feelings. And so I've had lots of examples in the past where, for one, a team very well-intended did not want a student to receive a behavior intervention because they really thought that the student needed to have a different placement and receive something else. And so we didn't use data for that. That was just what this team really wanted. We had some examples where, for example, if I wanted my son, back when he was in school, to have access to that really cool math intervention that my friend, the math teacher, was teaching, I could have made that happen. And that's not equitable. He didn't really need it. So we want to have those decision rules to help neutralize some of those biases that we may bring to decision making. So efficient, effective, and equitable. And I know that I can't hear you, but I want to pause and have you just say that like 2 times with me. So efficient, effective, equitable. Efficient, effective, equitable. Okay, thanks. So I want to give you an example of what this looks like in action. So I'm going to show you Sanjay. And this data shows his tier 2 intervention for behavior. So he gets points every day based on behavior, and that red line, that red horizontal line, is his goal. His goal is to get 80% of his points every day. The blue triangle or the blue diamonds are his daily points, and that black line is just a trend line to kind of show us what's happening. So I want to start by reviewing the team's decision rules around this intervention that are on the right side here. So the team decided that in order to start fading the intervention for Sanjay and for all students, their rule was that you would need 4 weeks of data, 4 or more days a week at which the goal was met at 80% or higher. Then there were 3 conditions for altering the intervention. And then if neither the criteria for fading or altering the intervention were met, they would continue to maintain until the next point at which they looked at the data. So I want to look at Sanjay because in absence of decision rules, if you were with me, here's what I am certain that some people would say, because it happens, we hear this a lot. So if I'm looking at Sanjay, I'm thinking, oh, he's on an upward trend. Like, this is awesome. He's headed in the right direction. That's great. Let's just keep doing what we're doing because something's working. That is our, I think, very human educator response. But when we look at this, and if we think about his behavior intervention, we have to look that he has had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25 days that Sanjay has been told, oh, buddy, you're on the right track. You're doing better. You didn't meet your goal today, but gosh, keep going. 25 days that he's gone home and had to say, I didn't meet my goal today, but they're telling me I'm on the right track. It's not going to take long before Sanjay is really done with this intervention. This is a stupid intervention. I don't want anything to do with it. And we could start seeing more behavior when we're actually trying to support behavior. So with decision rules, look what can happen. We know that he has 4 weeks of data. Yes, he has 5, but he has not met his goal. So we're not going to fade. We can look at these 3 alter conditions. So if 3 or more consecutive data points are below the goal line after the student has reached the goal line, well, he hasn't, so that one's out. If progress on the trend line indicates that the student will take more than 3 weeks before reaching their goal line, that's him. And we verify fidelity of this intervention. We don't know that in this example, but let's presume that fidelity was there. We would alter. So our decision rule around Sanjay would not be just to keep doing what we're doing. It would be to alter this intervention in some way. And that could look like more reinforcement, more feedback periods. Whatever we would decide to do, that would be based on this decision rule. So again, it allows us to not just think or feel about Sanjay, but to actually use an equitable process across all students to make some of these decisions. All right, I hope that helped kind of bring that to life. And at this point, I want to give you, again, I want to give you that 20 seconds or so to think about your data and pull out that T-chart and think about how are we using data to support decision-making at our ISD district or school, and how could we strengthen the use of our data intentionally. Okay, so let's wrap up by our Let's Do It section. So in this section, I'm going to propose some actionable things for you to do to kind of move this learning forward or to help you continue to strengthen your MTSS implementation. And so the first thing is to consider your why. Why did you participate, for example, in this professional learning session in the first place? How could implementing MTSS in your school impact you directly? Picture what this might look like in your district or school. Like, what does that really look like? How does it change the way you do business? How does it change the climate or the impact on students and staff? And then what is your own compelling why? That's one next step to take. The second is to engage. If you are not leading this work, for example, in your ISD district or school, if you're exploring it, consider engaging your leadership. And some of the ideas around this is helping the leadership start to think about a compelling why for implementing MTSS. So one thing that's really helpful is to look at a district's mission and vision statements. And often here we see a clue as to what's important to that district. And we can use that as to link into a compelling why. Maybe it's around student outcomes. Maybe there are more behavior referrals happening, for example, than anyone in the district would like to see. Or maybe you want to see stronger literacy outcomes. That might be the compelling why. Another thing can be a compelling why for engaging your leadership is around coordination of effort. It's really helpful when we can reduce silos and align priorities and have things work more seamlessly. We can be better consumers of resources that way. It feels better for staff, and it allows us to leverage the resources that we have. So engaging your district leadership in some of these talking points might also be a good next step. A third next step is to review the MTSS supports and resources on the MDE, Michigan Department of Education website. So I've referenced the MDE MTSS practice profile a number of times. There's a great free frequently asked questions document. There's a document on fiscal guidance, all kinds of wonderful resources. You can sign up to receive the MiMTSS e-newsletter that will keep you kind of in the loop with everything. Another next step could be to explore the MiMTSS TA Center supports. So there is a YouTube channel that has over 150 webinars and videos. There is a technical assistance catalog that many of you have accessed where you can find professional learning opportunities. There is tiered support, so you have universal professional learning offerings, targeted support, as well as more intensive level of support. You can access all of these different things on the TA Center website. And then lastly, I just ask you to consider as you close out of today, jot down 5 actions, 5 things that you might take to explore, get started with, or strengthen MTSS. And then whittle it down to like 3 that you really think you could do. Like put stars by 3 that, gosh, I could do this. And circle 1 that you commit to doing this week, or at least let's say prior to leaving on holiday break. And write it in your calendar, text someone, say, hey, I'm committing to do this by the time we leave for winter break. Bonus points for accountability if you find someone to kind of follow up with you and hold you accountable. I often need that in my life. You might as well. But taking some of these next steps to explore, to have conversations will, again, really help move you forward, either in this work or strengthening this work. And so I thank you very much for your time and engagement with this session. Here is your code, and hopefully that this met your need and was helpful.